I'm here with Nancy Kuhl. Nancy, hi.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Al. How are you?
I'm great. You're in New Haven-ish.
Yep, just north of New Haven, about a mile from the Yale campus.
Yeah, and normally when we're not stuck at home, you're at the Bonneke Library.
That's correct.
Well, we're here to talk very briefly, too briefly, about a page from this book by Susan Howe. Actually, a piece in this book called Melville's Marginalia from this wonderful book. And we're looking at a page from Melville's Marginalia, and I'll read 2 paragraphs from it, most of them, and then I'll have a couple of questions for you. I know that the 2 of us could talk for an hour about this, but here we go. Wilson Walker Cowan, using Merton Sealt's checklist, Harvard Library Bulletin, 1948-50, as a guide, collected and transcribed every page from every known volume of Herman Melville's library that Melville had marked or annotated. Only the pages Melville marked in each book are included, so there is a little forward trajectory to whatever novel, narrative, or poem. Each marked passage is a literal transcription from the particular edition Melville used. And I'm going to skip a little bit, but we'll post a copy of this text. What's noted further is that he submitted this as his dissertation at Harvard. Scholarly investigators have consulted and are still consulting Melville's marginal notations. The notations and annotations have been marshaled to support one critical reading or another. Wilson Walker Cowan's approach is loving. His informative and detailed introduction shows us why this author's marks seemed to indicate agreement with what he was reading. When Melville disagreed, he argued in the margin. There's another crucial paragraph in which we discover that Cowan discovered that some marginal notes were erased. So my first question, Nancy, to you is, why would a writer, even a famous writer's, marginal notes, which would be of interest to librarians, but why would such notes be interesting to a poet? What's interesting about this?
I think what's interesting about it has to do with the way marginal notations allow us to experience something of a reader's practice and a reader's experience of a text. So we're allowed, by way of the scribbles and the arrows and the underscoring, to understand something about what the reader's apprehending, finding important, finding valuable, wanting to return to, or of course disagreeing with, wanting to refute, all of those kinds of things. So I think a writer like Susan Howe, who is fascinated by Herman Melville and curious about his mind, as well as the books that he wrote, might find in his Marginalia an avenue into his thinking and his reading.
And Howe even finds the work of this, forgive me, drone-like graduate student, Wilson Walker Cowan, who's doing even then in 1965, very unsexy, unthrilling, work, basic work. She values it tremendously. What's poetic about the work that he does?
Al, it's so funny because I think there's a line that you skipped over right in the middle of that paragraph that I think answers that question, in that it connects Cowan and Melville and Susan Howe in this really interesting way. She says, Cowan submitted this synthesis of attraction and withdrawal as his dissertation. And I think that it's that idea of this synthesis of attraction and withdrawal is a kind of, that's what she's describing Cowan's process as a scholar of assembling this body of this body of texts that Melville annotated and Melville's annotations. But she's also, I think, suggesting that annotation itself, marginalia itself, is always a kind of process of mediating some kind of attraction and withdrawal, and thinking about it that way. And I think that's a way of thinking about Susan Howe's own poetics, that she's doing that same thing when she's sifting through various historical texts and becoming interested in the artifacts of the minds of other writers.
So the radical poetics entails seeing in this scholarly work, this textual critical work, attraction and withdrawal. So big sort of theoretical issues of desire, but at the same time sees in the work, because Cowan uses the original text typeset line lengths, this dissertation is versified, it's poetic. So what kind of poet, and you know Susan Howe's poetry very well, what kind of poet skips over the kind of influences one might find in predecessor poets to a dissertation writer working with someone's marginal notes?
I think there's a kind of a way of thinking about a compositional strategy in this kind of thinking about the way in which I think Susan Howe can recognize in Cowan's process a certain kind of dedication and care and deliberate thinking through how he's going to assemble these pieces to make up this book and make it manageable and apprehendable. But at the same time, that allows for an entering in of a certain kind of arbitrariness and a certain kind of chance. The fact of the typesetting makes it so that the lines of prose look like poetry. The fact of the alphabetical arrangement means that writers who might not otherwise be thought of together meet because their names are in an alphabetical range. And so I think Susan Howe may be interested in, or may recognize in that kind of movement between careful and deliberate scholarly research and the kind of chance that can enter in any kind of, all the kinds of arbitrary arrangements we have to choose to make information meaningful, to make it something we can think about and understand, like an alphabetical arrangement of authors. It's very sensible, but it's also quite arbitrary in that it takes nothing into account about what those writers may be thinking about or saying, or how Melville may have been interacting with any one of them. So there's a kind of chance to see things at a sort of sideways glance as well. And I think that's got something to do with how we read and think about poetry, and how poetry might be assembled by similar kinds of practices.
This piece, this work, Melville's Marginalia, is crucial, but not alone, in the revolutionary work that Susan Howe has done. That is to say, to overturn our assumptions about what constitutes poetry, American poetry. So let me just say what I think one revolution is here, and then I'd love for you to comment on that. One obvious revolution is there's text and margin. There's text and subtext. Subtext and margin are more interesting. That's quite a reversal, quite a revolution for a poet. Can you comment on that? And you're a librarian, so you love this stuff.
I do love this stuff. And I think more and more, lots of readers love it for the very thing you're pointing to, which is that when we elevate that which is sometimes considered secondary, or which is thought of as subject to something else, it allows us to see both things differently. Elevating the marginal commentary of any reader, which we do now often, certainly with historical books, scholars are interested in what we can learn, even when we don't know who the annotator was. So it's not only annotations of someone like Melville, who scholars may be interested in, but I think, Susan Howe's work is really revolutionary in calling our attention to those places where we can learn something in both directions by looking at everything slightly differently, by looking at this thing that might have been thought to be secondary or kind of beside the point, that actually gives us a different kind of access to the point itself, to the thing we are initially interested in.
We have time for just one more question. I mean, we could talk about this forever, but another thing that Howe does that I think is revolutionary is she's a love poet in a lot of ways. She looks for love and other strong feelings in places you wouldn't expect to find them. This is a perfect example in this guy, Wilson Walker Cowan, and you just get the sense that he didn't become Derrida, didn't become famous. He's he's just doing his work, right? And she really likes that. She just likes to discover people like that. And she describes his approach as loving. This is kind of a loving prose poem. What does she mean by his approach is loving, do you think?
I think, and you're right. I am a librarian. I'm also a person who is at often a library that Susan Howe visits often. So I have some knowledge of how this writer uses the library and uses library collections. And it is often with a kind of care and dedication and devotion to details and to these things that might be thought to be more in the margin, more to the side than to the sort of central fact of the matter. Right. And I think that there's a way of understanding that as that is a kind of, that devotion has a quality of love about it. Yeah. And that's kind of necessary, that any scholar who is, laboring in the basement of a library, hunched over books, in these kinds of, like you say, unsexy, not highly regarded ways, that kind of scholarship is not always rewarding in the ways that some other, let's say, Derrida's might be thought to be. And yet it requires this incredible dedication and care that, isn't so far a stretch to call that love. Mm. Maybe it's no stretch at all, actually.
No stretch at all.
I think it's absolutely a kind of love.
She turns people like this, characters like this, into heroic scholar adventurers and sees herself that way. There are some of her work where she appears to have an imposter complex with respect to the academy, right? And so this is part of that. She sees Cowan as a sympathetic soul, I think.
I think Nancy, she also...
Yeah, please.
Oh, I was just going to say one more thing. I think she also, kind of puts him in the same category as Melville and Hawthorne and herself as a library cormorant, as someone who has swum through libraries and books. And I think that's a kind of bringing him to that, elevating him to that level as well.
Nancy, thank you so much for doing this. This was great.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to see you.
Yeah, same here.
Always a pleasure to talk about Susan Howe's work.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
If you liked this episode, watch another and subscribe.
And join us for ModPo, a free and open course at modpo.org.